Of our semester review covering the course Implementing Policy and Regulation in Educational Settings. So in the last video, we talked about the introductions of public policy and how education policy is different than some other types of policies, and some of the main considerations on where policy comes from and things like that. Now for today, for this video, we're going to move into understanding the political context for policymaking, and specifically we're going to talk about country analysis and economic analysis, some of the cultural understanding that's necessary for policymaking to succeed, and then the economics, some of the numbers around policymaking. You might recall from the lecture that we discussed how political and economic systems don't necessarily align very well with one another from country to country, how there are some broad themes that cause similarities among nations with similar systems, but that no nations align perfectly with one another, even in zones where there's a lot of cooperation, like the EU, for example. Nations still have different preferences in terms of their policies and the critical criteria that are necessary for economic success. There's still some variation among those. We pivoted and started to talk about understanding culture as a context to the policymaking process. And specifically, we were talking about culture as it's understood or sort of measured by the 5 cultural dimensions model by Hofstede. Now specifically, those 5 dimensions include power distance index, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance index, and long-term orientation. We went through in class each of these. You can see the summary here on countries that have low power distance index scores versus those that are high. For example, a low PDI means flatter organization hierarchy, where a high PDI accepts hierarchy more readily, and they have more complex organizations. There's centralized decision-making among those organizations as well. So you can spend some time, pause the video, and read through these. The second factor in Hofstede's model is individualism. We talked about high individualism countries have high respect for privacy, where these countries also have, or these cultures also have, the individual as the unit of analysis rather than the group or the organization. And then low individual countries, people often work for the intrinsic rewards, that is, the internal reward of doing the work, whereas high individual countries have a tendency towards a need for rewards, external rewards. So pause that and take a look at these. The third category we reviewed was masculinity, low versus high masculine cultures. Low masculinity cultures are more consensual and they have more focus on quality of life, where high masculinity cultures tend to have a high regard for competition and materialism. And they're also rigid role relationships rather than more fluid role relationships. Pause that, take a look through each of these. Uncertainty avoidance was the next category. Some of the aspects of low versus high here. Uncertainty avoidance cultures that are low uncertainty avoidance means that they accept uncertainty more readily. It's more comfortable to operate in an uncertain situation. But high uncertainty avoidance cultures do not like things to change. They think that there is a single best way to do things, and that there's a rigid structure, and unless failing is more dangerous for them than not failing, then there's a resistance to being flexible. So you can take a look through these points. Long-term orientation is pretty straightforward. If a culture has a low long-term orientation, they think more in the short term. Their actions tend to be more focused on short-term results, quick responses. They don't really plan well into the future, whereas high long-term orientation cultures have a tendency to look farther out into the future. In this aspect of Hofstede's model also shows that thrift and education are positive values in high long-term orientation cultures. Now, there are some policy implications to each of these characteristics of the Hofstede model. But I think in terms of examples, long-term orientation is more easy to understand. In a low long-term orientation culture, the organization's planning window may be shorter than in high long-term orientation cultures. In high LTO organizations, in high LTO cultures, you may plan the next 10, 20, or 50 years of an organization, whereas low LTO cultures, the organizations may have a planning horizon that is typically shorter, months or years, but not decades, not often decades. So this is one where you can kind of see some of the practical implications. So we did a poll in class, and we measured the perspective of the class on each of these factors for the cultures represented in the classroom. And then we looked up Hofstede's actual assessment of these cultures. So what you can see here, this is Hofstede's numbers mapped for the US, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, and South Korea. So, for example, South Korea has the highest long-term orientation of any of the 4 countries, but Uzbekistan has the highest power distance index. Mongolia has the highest level of masculinity, and the US has the highest level of individualism. So each of these factors represents themselves in different ways in different cultures. But this was the map of Hofstede's numbers. So you should take a look at them and become familiar with them. Obviously, if you're from one of these cultures, it'll help you remember a little bit about how your numbers or your culture's numbers compare to the others. So moving forward, any analysis of political processes has to rely on the day-to-day realities and the relationships that are in existence within the organization and the culture. And relationships can be influenced by these cultural norms and cultural expectations that we just talked about in the Hofstede model. So you need to recognize that there are some tendencies that should be accounted for when preparing a policy or developing policies or implementing policies. Okay. We moved from Hofstede's cultural model into the political context, and we used these 5 considerations for evaluating the political context of a nation. Now, in Hofstede's model, I'll just remind you that we were talking about cultures, not specifically countries. Although cultures and countries often align, a culture doesn't have a stiff, strict barrier, whereas a country does. And so when we talk about political context, we're talking about only those within the national structure. But Hofstede's model is more of a cultural assessment, and it doesn't matter so much where the precise borders are within the culture, the dominant culture of those countries. That's what we were talking about with Hofstede. So the 5 considerations we reviewed for the political context are consensus, rule of law, competition, inclusion, and good governance. You may recall that we did a country assessment also in class. You can feel free to review the evaluation form that you have from that day in class, because that might be a good source of questions for the final exam. briefly, consensus means, does everybody have an awareness of how things are done? Is there an understanding of the rules of political life? Rule of law asks if there are specific structures in place that guarantees personal safety and that guarantees that laws that are in effect are followed. Is the judicial system fair and independent of politics or other influences? This is the assessment of rule of law. Competition asks if there is a monopoly within the political system or if there is the ability for multiple parties, not necessarily political parties, but multiple groups of people to exchange ideas in what's termed the marketplace of ideas, to exchange ideas on how to run the organization. And in this case, we're talking about the country. So is it legal to organize and to share ideas? And is there a system of checks and balances within and between the government branches? Inclusion asks if people are excluded from participation in the government activities and from politics for any particular reason, and there are several reasons given here. Good governance is the next factor. Is the political system functioning? In other words, are the organizations and the ministries of the government operating? Do they work well? Do they do what they say they're going to do? These are questions that help you understand if there is a generally good governance system in place, one that is potentially effective. It doesn't mean you have to agree with the rules. It just means, does it work when it has rules? So some of the takeaways from these two sections are, one, that understanding political context requires that you understand the culture. And two, deep influences can shape policy making in ways that are not obvious. This is important because when you're talking about policy making, you have to get below the surface. It's not enough to just say, here's a problem, here is the solution that I think fits, without getting into some of the more nuance, some of the more subtle components of policymaking. And third, that policy can be shaped to suit these contexts, whether we're talking about the cultural context or the political context. So this brings us to the point where we start talking about knowing the numbers. It's really important that besides having an awareness of the culture and the political landscape, that you start to understand the economic dimensions, the economic realities of policymaking. So specifically, we talk about numbers on a macro and micro scale. So knowing the numbers at the country level and then bringing it down to the micro level through the sector and the organization down into the actual problem level. Obviously, some problems are very big, like large-scale educational problems that affect the entire country are still macro issues. But we're talking about macroeconomic type of data when we talk about the large country numbers, and then we bring that down more specifically. So in the next several slides, you'll see some data and examples of what those sorts of numbers look like. So at the large level, we look at things like GDP or GNP and the same numbers on a per capita basis, per person. We look at inflation rates, unemployment rates. There might be other numbers of interest like the population density and population distribution. This is particularly important when we talk about education systems because students typically come together at a school location, and population density can drive those decision making around where to place schools and how to get students to participate. In very low population density countries, such as Mongolia, the placement of schools can be a very important decision that includes that affects access and participation rates. So we talked about other things like the utilization of public transportation or major components of economic activity. These are not the only sets of numbers that matter at the macro level, but they're just examples of macro level data that might be relevant in a particular policy-making situation. You may recall that we talked about which country is richer, the US or Luxembourg. I think most people in class understood that there is more than one way to answer that question. When we look at GDP on a total basis, the US has the highest GDP, and Luxembourg ranks in at number 72, just behind Uzbekistan and well ahead of Mongolia on a total GDP basis. But when we flip that and look at GDP on a per capita basis, Luxembourg is well ahead of the US, almost twice as high of a GDP per capita, and then the US has almost twice as high a per capita GDP as South Korea, and then South Korea is well ahead of Mongolia. But interestingly, remember that Mongolia's GDP per capita is almost twice that of Uzbekistan, and on the other column we saw that Uzbekistan has a higher GDP by far in total, but it also has a higher population. So if you look at GDP and GDP per capita as measures of richness in a country, or the measures of economic resources, they tell two different stories. So the next several slides are more examples of different types of numbers. This graph shows the trend in GDP in the country of Romania, and the point is that GDP can change over time. We don't like to see GDP drop, generally speaking, and what you can see on this graph is that historical events in the late 1980s and early 1990s relate to significant changes in Romanian society and in the political landscape. So there are times when GDP might drop significantly. Generally speaking, we like to see GDP continue to grow in any given country, but recognize that it's not fixed or stable, and it can fluctuate if there are enough external pressures put upon the economy. We talked about knowing how inflation affects income and money and the value of goods and services. These were three examples where if you had $100 invested in year one in three different investments, one that pays 2%, one that pays 6.8%, and one that pays 11%, when you go out to year 10, those numbers have gone up significantly for the 11%, but they've only gone up marginally for the 2% return on investment. If we looked at that from another perspective, you can actually go out to the future with a given amount of money and use a discounted cash flow assessment, a discounted cash flow evaluation, and determine what is that future amount of money worth in today's monetary units. By using assumptions around what the appropriate discount rate is, you can convert the future value of money into today's monetary units. And that's an important component to looking at multi-year investments. So the next couple of slides talk specifically about the comparison of North and South Korea. This was an example of the impact of foreign trade and international collaboration on the economies, as well as, in the case of North Korea, the impact of enforced isolation through the economic sanctions that have been placed on the economy over many, many years. So you can see a substantial difference in terms of GDP between the two nations. The growth rate between the two nations. South Korea grows much faster than North Korea. Total trade. And then we looked at a few other examples. This is California's GDP broken up by sector. And the point here is that a highly diverse economy is a more stable economy. If 80% of an economy's GDP comes from one sector, then it's at risk for sudden changes within that sector. California's GDP, with all of its various components and parts, represents a pretty diverse economy. There's still two big components of the economy that together are over a third of the state's GDP. So it still has some risks, potentially. The finance, insurance, real estate markets, for example, if there was a bubble or another bubble, like there was in 2008, if there's another bubble in those sectors, it could be a significant drag on the California economy. But again, the more diverse the economy, the more stable it is over time. Here's another set of numbers. Once again, these numbers are not all economic, but knowing your numbers at the macro level helps you understand the context better. So this is a map of the railway map of China, and so it lets you see graphically where the economic investments have been for the most part. We're not talking about small numbers here. We're talking about major activities, major economic activities and economic centers. So it's important to know sort of graphically how this tells a story that is backed up by economic data that you can also look at, but it would be harder to visualize than something like this. So moving from the macro numbers down to the micro numbers, we have to understand the health of the sector. An example is like the national education budget and its trends. Are they going up? Is the budget flat? Has the budget been cut? What's happened to it over time? We talked about understanding the costs of major initiatives that are underway and what's planned, because those initiatives may conflict or may complement some of the goals that you have as a policymaker. Again, sticking with the education sector, the funding per student is one of those micro numbers that's, again, important within the context of the education sector, but doesn't have a lot of impact in other sectors. Numbers of schools that are open now, planned and closing. Again, these are micro level numbers within the education sector and examples of the kinds of things you need to be aware of. Okay. Now, within a given sector, looking at the history and the trends is quite important. You can see that for this example, the sector has grown substantially from the late 1960s until 1990. And basically since 1990, it's flat. So knowing what's going on, what are the stories behind this particular sector that influenced its rapid growth and then its flattening. In this case, the story is explained by policy decisions and economic investments. So what is true in your sector? And you need to understand what is the story behind the number. Here's another example of a different industry. This one was fairly steady from about the 1940s until 1970s, and then it began essentially uninterrupted period of decline. And so you would want to know what does it mean for you? Not this particular industry, but what's happening to your industry. Was there a policy change that has had this impact on the sector? Or are you considering a policy that might have this kind of impact on the sector? So you need to think about the potential implications of policies that you might be considering. And remember that sometimes policies have unintended consequences to them. Another example of data, this is another visualization. Each of these small squares is a county in the United States, and so you can see how school districts within the United States are spending money as compared to the national average? Which ones are above the average? Which ones are below the average? And once again, if you're in this space, you would become familiar with the numbers that help you tell your story, that help you craft effective policy. Okay. On a more international note, here is a visualization. The national boundaries are somewhat hard to see, but this is the number of Chinese schools in the Philippines and as a heat map. And so once again, if you're in the space working on some sort of international education initiative, this might be a relevant set of numbers for you. So ask yourself, what are your numbers? You need to become familiar with the numbers related to your industry, related to the initiatives and policies that you're working on, and that's going to help you craft more effective policy. Here are some examples of education indicators based on the kinds of education reforms that are attempted. And while these are not a complete list, it gives you a good idea of some of the types of data that you need to pay attention to as an education reformer or an education policymaker. Some areas that you can see in the left-hand column, things like equity, relate to data around the admissions rate, the enrollment rate, the dropout rates, the rate that students are repeating classes, etc. Internal efficiency and external efficiency have a different set of numbers. Quality, typically measured by the test scores of students and sometimes by the cost or the investment per student. So take a look at these, be familiar with them, and know that this is one form of the data that you need to have when considering education reforms, but these are not the limit. You may find some data that's nowhere on this slide that is very important to you as a policymaker and for you to help educate other people about the kinds of policies that need to be implemented, either on the macro level, at the nation's level, or in a more micro organizational level. And so that brings us to the next topic, and that will be the subject of the next video.